Blood pooled on the tavern floor. 5 rival alphas circled the fallen king, baring their fangs for the final, gruesome kill. The kingdom's fate hung by a single fraying thread. But no one noticed the quiet Omega Waitress until she dropped her tray, drew hidden blades, and rewrote history. The year was 1247, and the biting winds of early winter howled against the thick stone walls of the Crimson Stag. Situated in the neutral trading territory of Oak Haven, the sprawling tavern and restaurant was a sanctuary for merchants, mercenaries, and weary travelers. Inside, the air was thick with the savory smoke of roasted venison, the sharp tang of spilled ale, and the overwhelming, complex musk of 100 different werewolf scents mingling in the heat of the roaring hearth. In the dimmest corner of the room, wiping down a scarred oak table, was Mave Gallagher. To the untrained eye, Mave was nothing more than part of the tavern's worn furniture. She was an Omega, a rank that in this brutal medieval era equated to a life of servitude, submission, and invisibility. She kept her gaze firmly on the floorboards, her posture stooped to minimize her presence, and her natural scent heavily masked by the bitter ash of burned wolfbane she rubbed into her clothes each morning. Omegas were not meant to look alphas in the eye, let alone harbor secrets. But beneath the coarse fabric of her serving dress, Mave's muscles were coiled tight. Her hands bore the distinct calluses of a master duelist, and her mind was sharp enough to cut glass. The heavy iron-wrought doors of the Crimson Stag groaned open, allowing a blast of freezing wind to bite through the tavern. The raucous laughter died in an instant. King Kalin of the Winterborn Pack had arrived. Kalin was a ruler of legend, a massive, broad-shouldered alpha whose progressive reign had brought unprecedented prosperity to the realm and earned dangerous enemies. He was attempting to abolish the ancient blood laws that allowed alphas to treat omegas and betas as disposable property. Tonight, he traveled incognito, wearing a simple traveler's cloak over his hardened leather armor, accompanied only by the heavy broadsword strapped to his back. He took a seat at a sturdy table near the center of the room, ordering a simple meal of roasted fowl and dark stout. Mave watched him from the periphery. She noted the heavy bags under his piercing amber eyes, the slight limp in his left leg from a recent border skirmish, and the way his hand hovered just inches from the hilt of his blade. He was exhausted, running on the fumes of sheer willpower. Then the atmosphere in the tavern shifted. It was a subtle change, a sudden drop in ambient noise, a chilling spike in the collective pheromones of the room. 5 men filtered into the restaurant, entering one by one over the course of 10 minutes. They did not sit together, but Mave's trained eyes caught the synchronized flicks of their wrists, the silent communication in the tightening of their jaws, and the deliberate way they positioned themselves to block every exit. These were no ordinary patrons. They were 5 of the most ruthless rival alphas in the Northern Territories. Lord Garrick of the Iron Jaw, a hulking brute whose face was a map of white scars, known for snapping the spines of his challengers barehanded. Baron Huxley of the Pine Barrens, a slender aristocratic wolf who preferred the quiet lethality of neurotoxins over open combat. Earl Desmond, a notoriously fast and cruel combatant, nervously tapping a spiked iron mace against his thigh. Count Lucian, a brilliant but unhinged strategist who wielded dual serrated falchions. Sir Tristan, a young bloodthirsty upstart desperate to carve his name into history by taking the head of a king. They had come for Kalin's crown. The ambush was executed with terrifying precision. It began not with a roar, but with a whisper. Baron Huxley, seated a table away from the king, flicked his wrist under the cover of his cloak. A tiny, needle-thin dart coated in a highly concentrated distillation of liquid silver and basilisk venom soared through the smoky air. Kalin's alpha reflexes were legendary. He caught the slight whistle of the projectile and twisted his torso, but his exhaustion betrayed him. The dart grazed the side of his neck, tearing a thin line through his flesh. The king hissed, slapping a hand over the wound. Immediately, the poison began its dark work, turning the veins pulsing at his throat a sickly necrotic black. "Now!" roared Lord Garrick, kicking his heavy wooden table aside so violently it shattered against a structural pillar. The restaurant erupted into absolute chaos. Civilians screamed and scrambled for the windows, overturning chairs and trampling their meals in a desperate bid to escape the clash of titans. The 5 alphas converged on Kalin, their eyes flashing a murderous gold, their fingernails elongating into deadly, thick claws. Kalin roared, a sound that shook the very dust from the rafters, and drew his broadsword in a flash of sparking steel. Despite the venom rapidly freezing his blood, the Alpha King was a devastating force. As Sir Tristan lunged forward, Kalin sidestepped the young wolf's strike, using the flat of his heavy blade to smash Tristan into the stone hearth, instantly knocking him unconscious. But there were 4 left, and the poison was taking hold. Count Lucian attacked from the left, his dual falchions creating a blinding whirlwind of steel. Kalin parried the strikes, the heavy clang of metal ringing over the screams of fleeing patrons. As Kalin pushed Lucian back, Earl Desmond capitalized on the opening. The spiked mace swung in a deadly arc, catching Kalin in the ribs. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the room. Kalin stumbled, his breath catching in a bloody cough. His vision swam, the edges of the room turning a blurry, dim gray. Huxley and Garrick stepped over the debris, their faces twisted into triumphant snarls. "Your little progressive experiment is over, Kalin," Lord Garrick spat, drawing a massive 2-handed executioner's axe from beneath his heavy winter cloak. "The old ways return tonight, and your head goes on a pike at the border." Kalin dropped to one knee, leaning heavily on his sword, panting through blood-stained teeth. He tried to force a partial shift to heal his broken ribs, but the liquid silver in his veins burned like hellfire, locking him in his human form. He was cornered. He was dying. The King of the Winterborn closed his eyes, preparing for the final strike. Mave stood frozen by the kitchens, clutching a silver serving platter to her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at her to flee. But Mave Gallagher was not just an Omega. She was the last living descendant of the Silver Hand, an ancient forgotten sect of shadow guards. Her bloodline had been hunted to near extinction by the ancestors of the men now standing over the king. For 10 years she had hidden in plain sight. She looked at Kalin. He was the only king in 3 centuries who had tried to protect people like her. If he died tonight, the kingdom would plunge back into an age of brutal tyranny. Lord Garrick raised his massive axe high. Clang! A deafening sound cut through the tension. The 5 alphas snapped their heads toward the noise. Mave had dropped her silver serving platter onto the stone floor. She stood there, head bowed, her plain brown serving dress blending into the shadows. "What is this?" Earl Desmond sneered. "A little serving wench wishes to die alongside the traitor king?" Mave slowly lifted her head. The meek facade vanished, replaced by a gaze so cold and focused that even Baron Huxley stepped back. She reached behind her waist and drew 2 exquisite stiletto daggers, cold iron, laced with silver. "Leave him," Mave said softly. Her voice cut through the silence like a razor blade. Garrick laughed, a booming, arrogant sound. "Tear the Omega apart," he commanded. Earl Desmond charged, moving with terrifying alpha speed. His mace swung directly at Mave's head, aiming to crush her skull in a single blow. Mave did not block. Instead, she executed a technique her ancestors called the falling leaf. As the mace descended, she stepped inside Desmond's guard with fluid, ghost-like precision. She slipped beneath his arm and struck like a viper. She did not stab him. She drove the weighted pommel of her dagger into a cluster of nerves beneath his armpit. Desmond gasped. His entire right side went numb. Before he could react, Mave pivoted, using his momentum against him. She swept his legs out and drove the flat of her blade into the base of his skull. Desmond collapsed unconscious before his mace even hit the ground. Total duration: 2 seconds. Count Lucian's eyes widened in horror. "Witchcraft!" he shrieked, launching forward with both falchions raised. "Anatomy," Mave corrected softly. Lucian was a master of dual blades, a whirlwind of offense. But Mave moved through his strikes like geometry itself. She read his attacks before they fully formed, slipping between lethal arcs with impossible precision. Lucian overextended on a heavy downward slash. Mave parried, not with her blade, but with her bare, calloused palm, redirecting his sword into the wooden floorboards where it stuck fast. In that split second, she struck. Her right stiletto flashed, slicing cleanly across the tendons of his wrists. Lucian dropped his weapons with a howl of agony. A swift kick to his knee sent him crashing down. Baron Huxley, realizing what he was witnessing, abandoned pride and drew another poisoned dart, aiming for Mave's back. But Kalin, still fighting through venom, saw it. With a strained roar, he kicked a broken chair leg across the floor. It struck Huxley's shin, ruining his aim. The dart buried itself harmlessly into a wooden pillar. Mave didn't even look back. She leapt onto a nearby table and launched herself at Huxley. She landed on his shoulders, locking her legs around his neck in a deadly vice. With a brutal twist, she slammed him into the stone hearth wall. The crack of bone echoed. Huxley slumped unconscious. 3 alphas down. Only Garrick remained. Lord Garrick stood frozen. His bravado had vanished. His eyes darted between his fallen allies and the Omega standing calmly in a stained apron, blades dripping with blood. It broke every law of nature he believed in. Omegas are weak, he growled, gripping his axe with shaking hands. Omegas submit. Mave tilted her head slightly. Her scent shifted. Wolfbane ash burned away during combat, revealing something ancient beneath. Rain-soaked pine, ozone, and raw, terrifying power. I am the waitress of the Crimson Stag, she said softly, and you have not paid for your meal. Garrick roared in panic and swung his axe in a massive horizontal arc. Mave slid forward on her knees across the blood-slick floor, slipping beneath the blade. As she passed under him, she struck. Both stiletto daggers found the gaps in his armor, severing the tendons in both legs. Garrick screamed as he collapsed, crippled. Silence fell over the Crimson Stag. Only the crackling hearth and ragged breathing remained. Mave slowly wiped her blades clean on a linen napkin from her apron and sheathed them. King Kalin watched from the wall, stunned and breathless. He had seen warriors before, but never anything like her. Mave approached him. For the first time, she did not lower her eyes. She met his golden gaze directly. "Your Majesty," she whispered, kneeling. She pulled a small glass vial from her hidden pouch. "Drink this, quickly." Kalin's hand brushed hers. A shock of energy surged through him. The mating bond ignited. He stared at her, realizing she was not only his savior. She was his fated mate. The golden antidote surged through King Kalin's veins like liquid sunlight, driving the basilisk venom back into nothingness. His breathing steadied as the crushing pain in his ribs faded. But the physical relief was nothing compared to the storm erupting inside him. The mating bond had awakened, ancient, absolute, unbreakable. Kalin stared at Mave, who still knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. Every instinct in him demanded he pull her closer, to claim her, to never let her go again. But Mave did not move toward him. Instead, she pulled her hand back as if burned. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This cannot be." She staggered backward, boots slipping slightly on the blood-slick floor. The legends of the mating bond were clear. An Omega bound to an Alpha King would lose their freedom, become confined, controlled, owned. Mave Gallagher had spent her entire life fighting for independence. "I will not be caged," she said firmly. Kalin rose slowly, still unsteady but recovering. "You will not be," he said, his voice low and certain. "Not by me." Before she could flee, he stepped into her path, but did not touch her. "You just killed 5 of the most powerful warlords in the Northern Territories," he continued. "Their allies will hunt you. You are not safe alone." Mave hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Finally, she gave a small, reluctant nod. Weeks later, Highmount Fortress stood at the center of political turmoil. Lord James Harrington and the captured warlords were brought before the royal court. The truth of the Crimson Stag massacre spread across the kingdom like wildfire. Within the Grand Council Hall, nobles erupted in outrage. Omegas cannot defeat alphas, one shouted. This is unnatural, Harrington sneered. This is madness, a manipulated story to justify rebellion. But Kalin did not waver. He stepped forward, his voice echoing through the chamber. She saved my life, he said firmly. She saved this kingdom. The hall fell silent. Then, in a decisive act that shattered centuries of tradition, Kalin spoke again. The old caste laws are hereby abolished. Gasps echoed through the hall. No alpha, beta, or omega shall be treated as property ever again. Days later, Harrington's empire collapsed. His crimes were exposed, his wealth seized, his allies arrested. The captured warlords were exiled beyond the borders. Peace returned, but not the old kind of peace. A new era had begun. On the highest balcony of Highmount, under a sky painted gold by the setting sun, Kalin stood before his people. And then he did something no king had ever done. He knelt before Mave Gallagher. I do not offer you chains, he said quietly. I offer you a choice. He held out the ancient diadem of supreme rule. Stand with me, not beneath me. Mave looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through her hair. The weight of history pressed against her shoulders. Then she stepped forward and took his hand, not as a servant, not as a weapon, but as an equal. Together they rose. The crowd erupted in thunderous approval as the kingdom itself seemed to breathe again. She was no longer hidden, no longer an omega in the shadows. She was the Alpha Queen who changed history. And under their rule, the realm entered a golden age of justice, equality, and peace, where strength was no longer defined by birth, but by choice. The legend of the Omega Waitress of the Crimson Stag would be told for centuries. And it began with blood on a tavern floor.